With the warrior caste of the Mamluk Sultanate engaged in a continuous defence against probing heretical navy and land raiding parties, their internal vigilance grew lax. The merchant class grew in power, the desperately needed funds and goods that their taxes provided, ensuring that none looked too deeply into their affairs. The realities of protecting their borders and keeping trade routes open by land and sea required the army's full focus, leaving the Sultanate's everyday policing understaffed and mostly neglected. The war had driven many out of their homes and into the Sultanate as refugees, leaving them destitute and with few prospects. Over time, more and more of the people fell into deep debt and were forced into ever more unfavourable contracts while the lenders grew rich and fat. This led to widespread resentment and distrust towards legal banks and other conventional lending institutions. Bribes kept the city guard at bay and even corrupted a number of Huadi, thus ensuring that the exploitation of people continued unabated. Many within the Sultanate became desperate and sought new funds from a shadowy financial organization known as the 10 Golden Horns, who clandestinely used the symbol of the ancient king Iskander, crowned with horns as their mark. They offered large loans in exchange for future physical labor. They claimed no riba would be charged, as these loans were Qard al-Hassan, according to the agents of the organization. Since these transactions happened away from the eyes of the courts, which the Golden Horns claimed were corrupt, instead of paperwork, the terms were inked into the skins of the debtors, so they would always be present in the case of any disputes. With no alternative ways to escape grinding poverty, a great many accepted this offer, despite stern warnings of ulema against modification of the body in any way, and became affluent overnight. These debtors began to flaunt their newly gained wealth in public, acting as unwitting recruiters for the Golden Horns. Eventually their numbers became so great that the Mamluk Sultan prepared to investigate the sources of this newfound opulence, but just as warrants were being signed, alarm bells rang and foe fires were lit at the beacons of Alexandria. In a surprise attack they had long prepared for, the armies of Jahannam fell upon Egypt. So it was that after a long period of false peace, in the year 1276 AH, a heretic fleet bearing golden Goetic symbols upon black flags stormed the port of Alexandria, while naval raiding parties took the city of Dumjat in a surprise night raid. Across Sinai came an enormous force of mechanized heavy armor supported by legions of infantry and mobile artillery, racing toward the border fortresses of the Mamluk realm. Mammon, the great prince of greed, had come to claim the lands of Egypt and beyond for his own. The Mamluks rushed to defend their ports and borders, emptying their garrisons and deploying their famed automaton cavalry to stop the invasion. But as the defenders of Egypt were drawn to their borders, the final step in the conspiracy of the 10 Golden Horns was finally put into play. The lords of the Golden Horns, long since sworn to secret fealty to Mammon, gathered their debtors to the great plazas and souks of Alexandria and Cairo, spreading a rumor that they were about to annul the loans due to the war. Instead of relief from their debts, the debtors were greeted by insidious poison gas unleashed upon the gathered masses of people. As the noxious fumes spread, people fell to the ground in agony. But there was no passing on to Al-Akhirah. The debtors of Mammon found themselves trapped in their convulsing bodies. The hidden clause in the contract ensured that the physical labor that they had agreed to would last for eternity. The victims were unable to cross to Barzakh. Instead, they rose from the ground as miserable twitching ghouls. Ensnared by the contract, they had been tattooed upon their very bodies. Commanded by the Goethic mages of the 10 Golden Horns, they assaulted Cairo and Alexandria from within, overcoming the depleted garrisons. And so it came to pass that the mighty Mamluk Sultanate was simultaneously assailed from the sea, across Sinai, and within the realm itself, and thus the doom of Egypt was sealed. The faithful household troops of the palace of Yashbak fought to the bitter end. Amongst the many tales of sorrow and bravery, it is told that the Sultan and his own personal automaton cavalry led a desperate last charge at the citadel of Saladin, all in vain as his chivalrous Faris died to the last man. Al-Hazar, the street of Al-Muis, the Kuala by Martazan, the mosque of Madrasa of Sultan Hassan, all were swept away in a whirlwind of blood, fire, and poison gas, their fabled treasure chambers plundered and stripped of their wealth. As the fighting ceased and the 10 golden horns took possession of the cities and towns, untold millions of gold dinars were offered to Maman as tribute by his followers, who desecrated the places of worship and turned them into temples of greed. Today's Egypt is a sad, twisted shadow of its former glory. From what was once a shining realm of gold and learning, the land has devolved into a miserable infernal protectorate known today as the plutocracy of the 10 golden horns, or more commonly, the domains of Mammon. The despots of the 10 golden horns lord over their oppressed subjects, extracting as much wealth as possible from their land and its people. Slaves toil on vast farms along the Nile, and in the mine of the desert where life is brutish and cruel, though mercifully short. Piratical ships gilded with gold embark from Alexandria to prey upon the trade routes of the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. With the loot and slaves gained from the expansionist policy of Mammon, there is plenty of wealth and prestige to be won by claiming new sources of wealth for the Prince of Greed. The plutocracy attracts the vilest followers of the sin of greed to join its legions as they strike further south and west, ever hungry for new plunder and loot. It is a great staging ground for further invasions towards the interior of Africa, perhaps even as far as the fabled realm of Mali. Beyond the borders of Egypt, the last of the Mamluks survive as soldiers of fortune of the desert, mercenaries and raiders who still bitterly oppose the Prince of Greed. The tithe caravans of Mammon are frequently attacked, and in the hidden masalas scattered across the wastes, the Adan can still be heard calling the faithful to prayer, and the poets of the desert recall the lost glory of the cities of the Nile. The High Atlas is said to serve as their base, but no expeditionary force sent to punish the Mamluks has succeeded, instead having their supply routes cut and their vanguards ambushed or led astray. Wherever they gather, the Mamluk Faris dream of the return of their glory and their ancestral home, an Egypt of song and legend, its cities and gardens purified of the filth of Shaitan. But between their dreams and hope stands all the vast power of the golden throne of Mammon. Alrighty, so part 2 of the lore of how Egypt fell, basically, covering how Mammon very cleverly inserted a unknown army of people. Now there's quite a few interesting words and phrases used throughout this. Let's run through some and have a little chat in the comment section. So the Qadi, as discussed in the last video, they're members of the judiciary, and they're supposed to protect people and enforce the rule of law. As the Mamluk Sultanate begins to fall apart through their greed and desire for gold that is being shown, they become a source of weakness, essentially acting as a force multiplier in Mammon's ability to destroy Egypt. The 10 golden horns is not a huge surprise that these have been mentioned previously as the other name of the Knights of Avarice, who are, within the world of Trench Crusade, the primary faction associated with Mammon. They take the image of Alexander the Great, who's very renowned in the Islamic tradition and is often identified as Du al-Qarnan. That means the two-horned one, a righteous king who is thought to travel to the ends of the earth, building a massive wall to protect humanity from Gog and Magog. In the Trench Crusade universe, that manifests as the Great Wall of the Iron Sultanate. The Alexander romance is a collection of legends about his life that are very popular in the Islamic world, and they portray him as a philosopher king or a prophet, even though there's plenty of scholarly people who kind of refute the connection between Alexander the Great and Du al-Qarnan, saying that they are actually very different people. Okay, so one of my favorite things that I learned basically from doing my research after reading this lore was Qard al-Hassan, which is apparently a benevolent loan. It's an interest-free loan granted for charitable purposes, where the borrower repays only the principal amount. So you only pay back what you borrow. There's no interest charged whatsoever. It's considered a virtuous act, and it aligns with basically laws that prohibit usury, I guess, the prohibition of interest as a concept. It serves social needs, fostering community support, and mutual responsibility. So apparently there's some key aspects of this. So there can't be any interest. You can't decide down the line that there should be interest. The entire principle, the base aspect of it, the whole reason why people would sign up and why it was used as a control point by the Knights of Avarice is that people feel there's no interest. And in this case, there was no interest. They charged no interest on the loans. The principal repayment, they only repay the exact amount borrowed. It is a voluntary, non-commercial act aimed at helping those in need. That's kind of less of what was done in the Trench Crusade lore in this instance, but it was certainly marketed that way to people. If the borrower is apparently unable to pay on time, the lender is encouraged to offer an extension or even to potentially waive the repayment, which is crazy. Now, there's a mention of the ulema, and they're scholars, basically, of the religion of Islam. And they're the people who advise against the information about the loans tattooed on your flesh, and part of that is because tattoos are no bueno, basically, in Islam. Now, so tattoos are actually quite complicated, from what I can tell, in Islam. This one thing I've been learning about recently is how tattoos are viewed all around the world, and in some places they can be very complicated. So there's kind of I don't want to say a definitive, because this is just based off my own research. So once again, people in the comment section, dive in if you know more. But basically, kind of within Islam, you should not be getting tattoos, as far as I can gather. The Prophet Muhammad apparently cursed people who performed tattooing and those who get them. So that's not a particularly strong look. I find it very interesting in this part of the lore that became an aspect of what the Knights of Avarice wanted people to do. And it's arguable that they saw it as kind of driving a wedge between people and their religion, or kind of humiliating them in that final way before giving them what they thought it was that they wanted, the riches, basically, to overcome their current situation. So by the time things go around to an ass beating, basically, and Egypt starts to really fall and the Mamluk Sultanate is destroyed utterly, essentially, you're looking at 1859, 1860 or so Georgian calendar. So that's kind of interesting that it happened so late. As I said in the last video, one of my favorite things about all this is discovering just how long a lot of this stuff took. Now, this was the really interesting stuff to me, because I don't know a tremendous amount about how the afterlife works in other cultures. So it is said in the lore that after the debtors are gathered up and poison bombed, essentially, that they cannot get in to Al-Akhirah, I assume is the pronunciation of it. That means the hereafter in Islamic eschatology. And for those who don't know, eschatology is the branch of theology that's concerned with basically how stuff ends, how the world ends. Judgment Day will bring a natural order to the temporal world called Dunya. that will come to an end, and the dead will be resurrected from their graves, and they'll be judged, assigned to either heaven or hell based off how they did during their lives. And there seems to be some kind of arguments made that whilst in the grave, the spirit gets a little kind of mild treatment, basically, as to one way or the other. So that's kind of very interesting to me. The phase between death and judgment, that's called Barzakh. And the lore specifically mentions that the victim of Mamon's gases are unable to pass into this state. They are trapped within these kind of convulsing, tortured bodies. And so they can't die. And they're trapped in their destroyed bodies as they owe Mamon a lifetime of physical labor. They're just denied the ability to die so that the contract can never end. So they are eternally contractually indebted to Mamon. It's kind of interesting because in Islamic theology, there's no quote-unquote undead, as we would consider them in popular myth and media. So in Trench Crusade, that's obviously like the trench ghosts. So creatures like zombies and vampires and things like that, they don't exist. So these guys are kind of like a Mamluk trench ghost army, but skirting that concept, basically based off the religion that it is that they represent. So in Islam, things like jinn are created from fire, and things like shaitan, they're demons, but they're not resurrected human corpses. That seems to be the key issue behind this element of the lore. So the army of Mammon become more ghoul-like, it says. The ghoul concept isn't mentioned apparently in the Quran, but it's part of Islamic folklore. So it looks like devs have taken advantage of that to kind of swerve things ever so slightly, which is pretty cool. I just really like that aspect of the lore. Alrighty, so there's a nice reference to Mammon using Egypt as a staging area for his activities in Africa, and specifically that he might be looking for the Empire of Mali. Now, at one point in history, the Empire of Mali was one of the wealthiest and most powerful states in the world, largely due to its control over vast gold mines and like really important trade routes, basically, specifically for salt, apparently. Who knew? At its height, it produced about half of the old world's gold. That's crazy. That is substantial wealth. So there's a little bit of information here. The Gold Empire. Mali sat on top of some of the richest gold mines in the world. Mansa Musa's fortune. Emperor Mansa Musa is considered one of the wealthiest individuals in history. His 1324 pilgrimage to Mecca was so extravagant, handing out vast amounts of gold in Cairo, and it caused inflation in the region. That is absolutely wild. So that's obviously what I would guess Mammon's end game is on the continent of Africa, as he wants to get to Mali, take control of all that incredible wealth that will be present there. There was a reference to a word, a Bimaristan. Bimaristan was a sophisticated hospital and medical center in the medieval Islamic world, functioning as the forerunner to modern hospitals. Established as centers for healing, education, research, they offered free care to all, featuring specialized wards, pharmacies, and libraries. So that's just another thing that I found interesting, a word that I had never run into before. And then the High Atlas is mentioned at the end as where it is suspected the Mamluks currently call their home within the game lore. It's North Africa's highest mountain range, stretching over 600 miles across central Morocco. It acts as a dramatic barrier, apparently, between the coast and the Sahara. So yeah, renowned for rugged, snow-capped peaks, deep valleys, and Berber culture. Remember, we had Berbers mentioned the last time as being a group of warriors that the Mamluks would very happily employ. So yeah, that's it. That's how Egypt falls, basically. This has been one of my favorite overall lore drops because I'm really interested in what is occurring in the interim. So if you consider the opening of the gates a bookend and 1914, the current world state, to be a bookend. I'm very curious about all the things that happen in the interim, and I would love large-scale lore drops that cover all these, that cover the rise and fall of certain nations, even if those nations no longer exist within Trench Crusade. And granted, with the Mamluk Faris, it's cool because we have the Faris character, but I'd be really interested, even if they don't have models, if they won't have miniatures, if they don't have any of that. I think a lot of us are and will be. But anyway, that's it for this video. As always, thank you so much for watching. Remember to like the video only if you actually liked the video. Curate your subscription feed and keep it free of AI slop. Check the description below. You'll see a link to the Creature Crusade that I am collabing with. Go there, take a peek at what we'll be doing. Watch the video linked in the end screen if you're really curious and you want to see. Thank you all for watching. Goodbye.